Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Are You Measuring the Right Social Media Metrics? My name is Jonathan Sape. I'm the founder of marketeers. We're really pleased to have you all here today from across the globe. We've got a great attendance today and very much appreciate you signing in. Before we start, just a quick bit of housekeeping. Just to make sure you can hear me and hopefully Richard successfully. It would be useful in your chat box, if you can see that on your screen in the webinar software, if you could just post a quick message to say hearing loud and clear or something to that effect. I don't want to be otherwise in mute mode for the whole conference. So if you could do that, that'd be fantastic. While you're doing that, just a bit of housekeeping. Richard will be speaking for about 30 minutes, and then we'll hopefully have around 10 to 15 minutes of questions at the end. By all means, write down your questions throughout the webinar, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. If we haven't answered all the questions, then by all means, email me, Jonathan Sape, after this webinar, and we'll do our best to follow up. You've got my email address on the welcome email that was sent to you. We're also recording this webinar, so we'll be uploading it to our blog in the next day or two. That's at www.emarketeers.com. So just one more thing. Just let me introduce Richard. So Richard Stacey, some of you may know him, some of you may not. I'll introduce him. He's a communications professional with more than 25 years of experience. He currently runs our newly launched social media crisis management course. For the last 7 years, he's specialized in helping organizations manage the transition from the world of conventional mass communication into the world of social media. So very good person to talk today. And prior to that, he spent 20 years working in corporate comms within the Saatchi & Publicis network. He's also a frequent speaker and lecturer on social media within both commercial, academic, and government sectors. And you may or may not know that he is the author of Social Media and the 3% Rule, How to Succeed by Not Talking to 97% of Your Audience. So, without further ado, I will now hand over to Richard.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan's done this slide actually to introduce myself. As he said, I've had kind of 20 years in the agency world and then 7 years kind of in the social media world. And what I do really, I describe myself really as a kind of trainer and mentor. So I don't run an agency to kind of help you do social media or do social media on your behalf, but I help organizations kind of work out what they should be doing in social media. And my mission, I think, if I can say I have a mission really, is to clarify all the unnecessary complexity and confusion that exists, and in some cases actually deliberately being perpetrated about social media. Because I actually think social media itself is not actually that complicated. The basics of understanding social media are quite simple. It's not the same thing as saying social media is easy, but social media need not be a complicated business. So anyway, we're here today to talk about measurement, and I guess there are two kind of basic premises really that I want to kind of establish around how organizations are using or are not using effectively social media and social media measurement. And I think from my own experience, very few companies at this stage really genuinely understand social media. They may think that they do, or they may be being advised by an agency or a consultancy that thinks that it knows. I don't think many organizations have really worked out the social media environment. And what this means is we're actually making the wrong assumptions about what this environment is, how it works, and therefore what we should be doing within it and how we should be measuring it. Or we're trying to make this environment work in a way in which the previous environment that we understood worked. And we're also very much being seduced by the tools. So there are a lot of purported measurement tools out there that look extremely kind of complicated and involved, delivering vast amounts of kind of data and everything else. And it's very easy to get drawn into these tools because they look so impressive. And then the trouble is we then find our activity becomes skewed against our usage of the tool rather than perhaps actually being the activity that we should be doing. And kind of what we're doing is we're failing actually to recognize some very wise words that Einstein himself actually came up with when he said, not everything that can be counted, i.e. using a tool like this, actually counts, and not everything that can count can be counted. So, I'd like to kick off first with a little story about social media measurement. This is something that happened to me. About a year ago, I think, I was actually invited to Vienna to take part in to run a workshop basically for a large FMCG company. It was their regional digital and PR people from kind of Eastern European and Middle Eastern region gathered together. As part of this regional gathering, they actually wanted to do a workshop that looked at where they were going with social media and kind of identify what the next step should be for them. Because I think they've been in the kind of social media space for a fair while, but they were starting to get an indication, I think, that perhaps they needed to change things. So anyway, we were in this workshop, about 15 or 20 people sat around the table, and I said to them, okay, so what basically is your social media strategy? And they said, well, our social media strategy is Facebook, right? There's this great big place where all our consumers are called Facebook. They're all there. We've got to be with them. So Facebook is what we've basically been focusing on. We think we've kind of done Facebook now. So the next part of the strategy is to work out how to be in Twitter. So, okay, we've done Facebook. Let's try and crack Twitter next. And once we crack Twitter, we're probably going to move on to, whatever else is the next thing that comes along we feel we need to crack. And so I said, okay, what is your objective in your usage of Facebook, your social media strategy? And they said, well, our objective is to maximize the reach and engagement of our Facebook presence. Kind of almost obviously that's what you would do. What else would you do in Facebook? I said, okay. So what are you actually doing to achieve this objective? And they showed me this very elaborate kind of content schedule that they produce centrally that they could then push out to all the various regions and all their various agencies. They identified what on any given day they could be posting within Facebook and supporting that with images and videos and links, etc., etc. So an enormous, great big kind of centrally driven and devolved kind of content and posting production schedule. And I said, okay, so how are you actually measuring that? What's your measure of success? Or sorry, what are the metrics that you're using? And they said, all right, we've got this amazing tool called Sprout Social. It measures everything. Nothing can happen in our kind of Facebook world that isn't being measured. We can see what our most engaging posts are. We can see where people come from, where they go to, which regions are performing best in terms of creating Facebook engagement. It's a fantastic tool. And I said, okay, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you. Which is, this is all the stuff that this is what you're measuring, okay, this is the output, this is where you want to get to, being measured by this tool. First question is, how does any of this stuff that you're doing and measuring here translate actually into a benefit for the business, a creation of value, source of business benefit, like, I don't know, creation of sales, for example? And they kind of said, yes, that is the tricky question, isn't it? We've been looking for the tool that tells us that. Do you know what would be a good tool to use to tell us that? And I said, I don't know of any good tools to do that, and I don't think the problem is a lack of a tool. I think your problem quite possibly is a lack of something to actually measure, because it may be quite possible that all this stuff that you're doing and all this activity that you're creating, all this measurement you're doing, there isn't actually a connection between that and the creation of any value for your business. And the second question I'd like to ask you is this, which is, what is the link between all this Facebook activity that you're doing and actually what it is you are then measuring? At this point, somebody kind of put their hand up and said, that's a point that's been bugging me. She was relatively new to the team. She said, I've been finding as I kind of look at my kind of Facebook dashboard, I'm kind of seeing all the measurements and everything that's going on here, I'm finding actually that what we are actually doing in Facebook isn't really responsible for generating most of this activity anyway. What's happening in Facebook seems to reflect other stuff that's going on, other stuff that's happening on the brand, or maybe a new ad campaign we're doing or whatever. And I said, all right, hold that thought. That's a very interesting thought. So just to kind of get us on the page as to where we are with this, you've got this very large amount of activity that you're doing and spreading out through your region, which you're measuring with this tool that you've got, but you aren't actually able to really establish precisely what the connection is between all this activity and what it is you're measuring. Neither are you able to establish a link between what it is you're measuring and any kind of form of business benefit. And I think that to me kind of indicates, I think we probably have to sit down and slightly start to reorientate your thinking about how you should be using social media. And I think the answer to this you probably already know, because it lies in what you're already finding, which is that Facebook potentially is a very good way, or one way in any case, of working out what people are thinking about you, rather than perhaps a place you need to be looking at as a way of telling people what to think about you. And I then told them this other story, which another story happened to me a couple of years ago. I was speaking at it was a Digital Age conference in Turkey. So in the audience there are about 700 or 800 people, the great and good of the digital and marketing industry in Turkey. I was being actually quite critical of how people were using Facebook at this particular time, and I think saying they were wasting a lot of money in Facebook, largely because what was going on in Facebook at this time was that people were actually just trying to replicate their website as their Facebook page. Anyway, at the end of the presentation, someone came up to me. She was the marketing director of quite a large retailer in Turkey, and she took issue a little bit with what I was saying about Facebook, but then she said the great thing about Facebook is that it tells me what people think of my latest TV ad. And I'd say to her, I think you're absolutely spot on. That is actually how you should be using Facebook, to find out what people think about what you're doing, rather than perhaps a place that isn't necessarily the place you should be putting your TV ad within. And from this, I'd like to kind of place a thought with you as we kind of sit there and think about social media measurement. And that thought is this, therefore, perhaps you shouldn't actually be measuring social media activity. Perhaps social media activity itself is the measure. And another thought that kind of comes from that logically is that therefore perhaps a Facebook like, it's a bit like a degree Celsius, right? It's something that has no value in and of itself, only insofar as we can use it to measure something else. You know, the Facebook like kind of shows what the temperature is like, if you like, on your brand. And from that then flows another kind of slightly more outrageous thought, which is, therefore, activities that are designed simply to generate social media engagement, it's kind of a bit like the equivalent of putting the thermometer in a glass of warm water in order to raise the temperature. So you're kind of thinking, what do we need to do? We kind of need to raise the engagement temperature on our brand. How are we going to measure it? Through how much increase in engagement we get on our Facebook thermometer. So that's what we need to kind of push up the engagement on our Facebook thermometer. What's the best way of doing that? I don't know, stick it in a glass of hot water and that will raise the temperature. Now, of course, you're not actually raising the temperature by doing that. You're just skewing the measurement and the metrics. And there are, in fact, quite a lot of organizations. That may seem a rather silly thing to do, but that doesn't stop the fact that there are an awful lot of organizations that are doing it, as seen, or we can see, with this company called Social Bakers. You may have come across them. They produce tons and tons of statistics about kind of usage of Facebook and Twitter and all the rest. That's largely generated to kind of work out who is creating the most engagement and who's doing all this stuff most effectively. And they produce reports every month that kind of report back on who's doing the best Facebook content. And I've taken some information from a report they put out actually about this time last year, where they were rating the UK's most engaging posts in Facebook. So the UK's third most engaging post this time last year in Facebook was appliances online, with a post that says click like and you could win £500 of Electrolux, blah, blah, blah. Okay, third most engaging post. The second most engaging post in the UK last year in November was Asda, with click like if you'd love to win £100, blah, 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 blah. And wait for it, the UK's most engaging Facebook post in November last year was appliances online again, with click like if you fancy winning 3 Samsung, blah, 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 blah. Now, I don't know if we should necessarily be particularly surprised by all this kind of stuff, because we already know, basically, when it comes to Facebook and competitions, if you want to create competitions are basically the most effective way of creating Facebook engagement. If you want to kind of push the needle on your Facebook engagement thermometer up, run a competition, okay? But just because competitions might be the most effective way of creating Facebook engagement, that does not mean that the most effective way of using Facebook is competitions. Nor does it even mean, actually, that Facebook is the most effective way to run a competition, because it's only worthwhile running a competition in Facebook, basically, if you want no one to participate. As Social Bakers then also showed in some information they were putting out in this same report. And what they were doing here is they were comparing the average post engagement rate between different sectors in order to work out which sector was creating the most engagement, which sector was creating the least engagement, and what you could learn from this in terms of what activities created the most engagement and what you should be doing. Now, the interesting thing for me wasn't necessarily about what sectors were supposedly doing the best. The interesting thing was over here, these stats. Because the most supposedly successful sector in terms of creating Facebook engagement, the alcohol sector, was creating an average engagement rate of 0.40%. Now, my wife used to work for a direct marketing agency, and I said to her, what would you think if you were a client and your direct marketing agency ran a campaign that generated 0.4% response rate? And she said, I think I'd fire the agency. Which is right, because generating 0.4% response rate, kind of anything, is a stupid thing to be doing. But bear in mind also, this isn't 0.4% of your target audience that you're reaching here. This is a measure of the percentage of your so-called Facebook fan base that have engaged with your post. And even the most supposedly successful brands in social media in terms of generating Facebook followings, you can only ever really expect that your Facebook following is going to be something less, significantly less, quite possibly, than 1% of your total audience. So, the definition of success, as far as these guys were saying, was the ability to reach 0.4% of less than 1% of your target audience. And in fact, the latest information, in fact, I got this information just this morning when I got an email from Social Bakers with their latest report. Within the UK, the average post-engagement rate in Facebook is 0.22%. Okay, and if we then take the assumption that this is 0.22% of 1%, we can conclude, therefore, that Facebook is a good way of reaching 0.002% of your audience. Now, it's not necessarily a silly thing to do to reach 0.022% of your audience, dependent upon what it is, who these people are, and what it is that you are doing with them. But if all you are doing with these people is basically putting in front of them any form or any derivation of conventional audience-based content, promotional, marketing activity, that is a total waste of time and effort. And actually what it means, if you follow the logic of that through, if you're kind of got a social media team or a social media engagement or a social media agency that you're using to produce this kind of stuff, probably the most effective ROI you're going to get from the usage of that agency is to tell them to turn their computers off and get out of the office and put a billboard on and go walk up and down the high street. Because if you've got your content on a billboard and you're walking up and down the high street, you're probably going to be in front of and or engaging a hell of a lot more people than you're going to be doing by trying to do that stuff on your Facebook page. And this is a core truth essentially about social media that you have to understand in order to work out what you should be doing in the space and how you should be measuring it, is that there are no audiences within social media. Traditional media was all about an audience. Traditional media came with the audience attached to it. But social media does not come with an audience attached to it, nor is anything to do with audiences really what's going on in the space. And to understand this, you just need to work out what it is that a lot of these tools like Facebook were actually designed to do. Facebook was basically designed to help geeks get girlfriends. That's what it was designed to do. And you don't need an audience of girlfriends, nor if you want to have a girlfriend, get a girlfriend, is it a very good idea to stand up in front of an audience of potential girlfriends and say you want one. And in fact, this kind of fact about actually looking at how people use the space and what the things in this space are all about is the thing that we are not doing. And we are thus not understanding the environment of social media, and critically we're not understanding how the social media environment is different from the traditional media environment. Now the traditional media environment is essentially the world of the audience, right? And the reason for that is because we haven't been able to speak to groups of people other than audiences, because the channels that we've had available have all been audience-based channels. And as a result, traditional marketing activity is all about channel and message. And therefore the way in which we measure channel and message is all through reach and frequency. Now, it may well be that you speak to organizations and you say, there are no audiences in social media, there are no audiences in Facebook. They can understand that fact. But what that therefore often leads them to believe that the task is, it's like, okay, there aren't any audiences in this space, so our task is to create an audience in this space. And so many social media strategies out there are all based on the premise of building yourself an audience within the social media space. A Facebook fan base, creating likes, creating followers. But of course, the only reason that you're doing this is so that essentially your existing channel message strategies and your reach and frequency metrics can also continue to work in the space. You're trying to change the space so that your old way of doing things and your old way of measuring it will continue to work. Now, of course, you can potentially take stuff that works in one space and make it work in another. But I would suggest that when you do that, you're doing effectively the equivalent of this. Trying to make your car that works very well on the land float so you can make it work in the sea. And if you see any kind of social media strategy that talks about reaching out, for example, it's a floating car type of strategy. Because reaching out is basically the way we talk about targeting social media, because we don't want to use the word targeting because it doesn't sound social enough. So we say we don't target people, we reach out to people. Or any kind of strategy that talks about creating engagement, this notional thing called engagement, with target audiences is the wrong approach, because there are no such thing as target audiences in social media. There are only individuals, and these people aren't even target individuals, because what's happening in the space, they don't want to be targeted. You are the target in the social media space. You identify these individuals in terms of the way in which they wish to target you, not by targeting them. So social media essentially is the world of the individual. And what you need to do in this space is all about, it's driven by how you identify behaviors and how you respond to those behaviors. And the way in which the space itself is being used, it's being used by the people out there, not as a form of media. No, Facebook isn't being used as a form of media. Facebook is being used like a set of tools or infrastructures. That's the way the people in the space are using these things. And of course, it's never a sensible idea to measure your frequency of tool usage, okay, or even your effectiveness of tool usage. That's a bit like saying the best way to measure a carpenter or see if a carpenter is effective is to see how effectively or how frequently he uses his Facebook hammer, right? That's a silly way to measure any kind of form of effectiveness. What you have to do, your measurement has to be related to what it is you wish to make. So if you want to set of bookshelves, you need to see how effective the carpenter is at using his tools to make a set of bookshelves. The effectiveness of creating the bookshelves is never going to be driven by how many times he hits an engagement nail on the head with his Facebook hammer. And this really brings us to this is a core truth about anything when it relates to measurement, not just simply social media, but the measurement has to be linked to value, not simply to the creation of activity. If you haven't got that connection between the activity that's being measured and value that's being created, you are wasting your time. And so it doesn't matter how good all the activity looks or how much activity you're actually creating, unless it's connected to the creation of value, it's senseless. And the way that you connect activity to value is through objectives. The objectives are the bit that provides the linkage between the two, actually having a defined business objective, what it is you want to use social media to achieve, what it is we want to build. Do you want a set of bookshelves or do you want a chair? And this is the bit that most organizations forget. The critical and most important part of the process really they overlook. And the reason for this, I think, and the reason they overlook objectives is there's two reasons. One, they either travel with their existing marketing objectives, okay? So they don't think they need another set of objectives. The problem is these objectives have been conditioned to work against how the audience space, channel message space works. And social media is a very different space. It's not very good at reaching audiences because there are no audiences in social media. So social media is never going to really push the needle against a conventional marketing objective. And the other reason they overlook objectives is because they simply think, well, reach and frequencies is what we should. That's how we've always measured effectiveness. So we just find ways of extrapolating reach and frequency from the traditional world into the social world by doing the kind of stuff that social bakers are reporting on here. So we've basically got the objectives covered. We don't need to think separately about them. So what I'd like to do now, though, is to show you some examples of organizations that actually have understood what to do in social media and how to connect it with the measurement of value. And the fact that essentially, objectives, activity, and measurement have to be three kind of independent legs of the same stool. And that if you actually just simply conflate objectives with activity, what you end up with doing in most instances is creating just a two-legged stool, and two-legged stools don't work very well. So here's an example of an organization that's worked this out, which is Vodafone. Now, Vodafone's problem, their business issue they had to address, was that they actually had they had a long-term need to hire about 40 specialist technicians. Right? But this was in an area that wasn't traditionally associated with mobile telecom. So if you're one of these people, you wouldn't necessarily consider Vodafone to be a potential employer. And because of this reason, it's difficult to reach them. They're either going to have to do that through advertising or with recruitment agencies. So they had about a 1.5 million budget to do it. So their objective, right, was to hire at least 50% of these people via direct recruitment through social channels, thus saving £750,000 of advertising agency costs. What they then did, the activity, the process, was they trained their existing employees in this area on social networking and publication techniques so they could raise the profile of what Vodafone was doing in this space. Interestingly, they said, do not simply go in there and advertise the availability of jobs. Don't just jump in there and say, hey, Vodafone's recruiting in the space. And the result of this fact, over a certain period of time, about 80% of the hires were made in this way. So they saved 1.3 million. Very easy to see what their objective was, very easy to see how that informed the activity, very easy to see how to measure it, and also to see how effective it was being. And actually the insight really that flows from this, which is a very important one, is that social media is actually a business process. And in fact, it can be applied to almost any area of the business, not just simply marketing. In this instance, they were applying it to making their recruitment process more efficient. And it's a process that's driven by behavior identification and responses, not through communications outputs, content, whatever. Here's another example. I love this example, mostly because it's just so basic and boring, actually. It's about cheese. And I got this one from someone called Dr. Natalie Peterhoff in the States, who's very much into kind of measurement and return on investment. I encourage you to check out her stuff. Anyway, this particular company, their business objective was they wanted to identify the occasions on which consumers most enjoy cheese. And to confirm the hypothesis, seems a rather strange hypothesis in my opinion, but anyway, it's what it was, that consumers most enjoy their cheese products in a barbecue setting, right? So what did they do? They just simply listened to the space. And they found that cheese gets the most buzz and conversation at breakfast time. You know, consumers are talking more about making omelets than they are about making cheeseburgers. So what did they do? You know, they placed cheese next to kind of dairy products and eggs in the dairy aisles. You know, they developed a commercial in a breakfast setting. They created other breakfast
All right, I should be back on now. Can people hear me? I'm not using my microphone. I'll just put that in because that might help you better. Right, just plug them.
Can people still hear me?
Hi, Richard. We can hear you loud and clear now. Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, okay.
Technical problems, but please bear with us, and I'll let you carry on, Richard.
Okay. So, listening and creative intelligence, that's where the greatest lies, I think, in social media. I can get us to get to the next page. Oh, yeah. So when we're actually coming to talk about usage of agencies, I think rather than agencies that you could kind of, you know, if you like the billboard in the high street agencies, it should be agencies like this, an organization like, please, company, we actually identify what are the kind of the key psychological, physiological, and social issues associated from others with kids' nutrition. They're able to then go into much greater depth about each one of these issues and find out in specifically what user attitudes were in the space and what kind of language they were using to describe their issues here. Classic another one. I mean, here of course they weren't even reaching out at all to anybody. They were just simply listening. Here's another classic one, which is IBM and its Listening for Leads program. What did they do? They simply trained their sales team. Their biggest problem in that was how they generated qualified leads. They could find how to reach these people using traditional media, but they couldn't find a way of reaching them at the time they were potentially interested in an IBM product. But they could do that using social media because they could listen to what people were saying and they could join those conversations. Logitech, another great one. Their problem was they have a huge range of products that are really quite technical. There's therefore an enormous range of kind of questions that are asked about how you use the products, which is an enormous cost to their business. What they did was they set up a customer service community that allowed the individual customers to start to answer customers' questions. And in fact, when it comes to actually creating how they were creating value from this, they were found, for example, that their #1 customer in that space was actually generating $250,000 worth of value per year in call deflection costs. So, if anyone kind of tells you you can't measure social media activity in cold, hard kind of dollars, you absolutely can. In fact, I would say if you can't measure it in cold, hard dollars, you're probably doing the wrong thing. Another really an old example of this goes back to about 1996, which is Lego Mindstorms. Their problem was they had this product range called Mindstorms, very kind of technical, geeky, programmable kind of product. They needed, if sales were going down, they needed a new generation product out there. They were even wondering whether they would invest the time in kind of developing a new generation product given that sales were declining. What they did was they identified there were a group of similar type of superfans, chaps like this. These weren't influencers in the social space, but these were people who were very interested in the product, and they said to them, would you be prepared to work with us to develop the next generation of Mindstorms? We're not going to pay you any money, but could you actually work with us to develop the product? They said, yes, absolutely. And I think it was just 12 guys in the end they ended up using, but it helped them redesign this product line and launch it very successfully. And the key thing about this is productive engagement, okay? It's the engagement you want your customers to give rather than the engagement that you want to create. And the fact actually that an example like Mindstorms happened quite a few years ago, I think is quite interesting, because I certainly found in the very early days of social media there was some really quite interesting stuff that was going on. But then what happened was this thing called Facebook suddenly arrived, right? And all the marketing directors who up until this point hadn't really been interested in social media suddenly kind of became interested in nothing else other than Facebook and this kind of magic Facebook kingdom that all their consumers were in and that they wanted to be in and engaging with them in. And they kind of almost believed in this thing called, what I call the Facebook fairy. The Facebook fairy could come along and kind of sprinkle some kind of magic dust on the content that they put in the space and it would spread throughout the network. And what companies then started to do was stuff like this. These are examples of Facebook pages a couple of years back, and you can see they all look like websites. Of course, this is how companies saw the Facebook challenge at that particular time, which was, there's this space called Facebook we don't really understand, we don't know how to measure, but we really understand websites, so we know how to measure them. So if we can take our website and put it into Facebook, that's a way of measuring it and seeing how successful it's being, which, of course, if you think about it, is it's a foolish thing to be doing. Now, Facebook has stopped people doing this because its format has changed with timeline, but people are still doing the equivalent of that activity, and that activity is this senseless kind of quest for the generation of social media engagement and putting content out there that gets the most gets the most likes, etc., and the most shares. And I think what this has done, actually, it's meant that we've had a kind of phony war in social media up until now. We've been fighting the wrong battles. We haven't really worked out where the key battle is going to occur. And I actually think the key battle is going to occur, the one that's going to really make the difference in terms of kind of the change of approach, the switch of the era, if you like. It's all around how you extract value from listening and response. And actually the key brand benefit that comes from this is how a brand can create the expectation of listening. Up until this point, the expectation that we have of brands is delivered through product delivery, essentially, product or service delivery, what the product or service is like. And we put a whole load of stuff around that to try and make it appeal more kind of interesting through ads and everything else. But fundamentally, it comes down to that experience of the product. But we now have an opportunity to create a whole different experience, which is the experience of the behavior of the brand to a large extent, and the extent to which that brand is actually genuinely listening to its consumers and reflecting what they want. And personally, I actually think how you compete in this space could end up being even more important fundamentally than actual product delivery and product experience. And I don't think many brands understand that at the moment, but I think the brands that work this one out, the competitive advantage they're going to extract by understanding how to push the needle against that, I think is actually going to be extraordinary. So anyway, just to kind of summarize, this basically is what most organizations are doing at the moment, in my opinion. Okay, they are pushing the audience creation boulder up the social media mountain. And what they're doing is they're kind of measuring how many kind of engagement millimeters, if you like, we've actually pushed that boulder today, and potentially getting very excited because, you know, yesterday we pushed the boulder 5 engagement millimeters, and hey, today we pushed it 10 engagement millimeters. You know, we've increased our social media engagement by 100%. But effectively, what's happening here, what these people are doing, is they've a fundamental failure to understand and locate the source of value in the environment that they are operating within. And until they do that, you know, they're always going to be caught into this kind of activity of either having been seduced by the tools or as I say, pushing the audience boulder up the hill, because the audiences is what, up until this point, all our marketing activity has been about, and we've addressed it through content and measured it through reach and frequency. So the learnings, really, I think, that come out of this are these. First of all, you have to measure the creation of value, not simply the rate of activity. And activity only becomes connected to value by establishing the right objectives, the right business objectives. Usage of social media, usage of the tools, being in the space, is never an objective in itself, because you can't measure you don't measure your usage of a tool. Now, in the old days, as it were, simply being in media could be an objective, because if you were in media with the right message, you would be in front of an audience, therefore it would create value. But that's because the space we were in had an audience attached. There isn't an audience attached in the social media space, and in the social media space you're only ever speaking at any one time to a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of your audience. And that means actually that social media strategy has to be understood as a business process strategy, and it's about behavior identification and response. It's not about channels and content, and it's not measured through reach and frequency. And the value in this space is created through the ability to listen and respond, and in effect what's happening in social media is the measure rather than the thing that you need to be measuring. And so I would really say what you have to think about is go with the social media gravity. Work out what's happening in this space, and that will inform what you need to do and how you need to measure it, rather than trying to make the space work like the old space work, and then effectively measure your effectiveness in doing that, which is the equivalent of measuring how far up that social media mountain you've pushed your audience boulder. So thank you very much, and apologies for the little break in the middle there. I don't know why that happened, but the connection, I think possibly at my end, just dropped out for some reason. But anyway.
Thank you, Richard. Can you hear me loud and clear, hopefully?
I can, yes.
Good. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. We have, let me look at the time. We do have about 5 or 10 minutes, well, 5 to 10 minutes for some questions. But I would like to thank you, Richard. I thought this was a really fascinating area, and I'm sure it's very relevant to all listeners today. There were some really salient points and messages that you made. And I would also like to apologize for the short outage. It just goes to show that technology is not 100% perfect in this age.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. So Ross asked a question. He said, we often hit over 20% engagement rate on our posts with around 26,000 fans. Does this mean we have to use Facebook differently? Which is a very interesting question. What are your thoughts, Richard?
Well, I suspect you'll probably find that it depends really what you're doing in the Facebook space. I generally find most organizations get much better value when they use Facebook, when they treat Facebook as a language, really. And if people want to talk to them in Facebook, that's how they can talk to them back. If you're using it as a way of kind of pushing information out to people, even if you're doing that in a way that is, by comparison with lots of other people in the space, quite effective, it's probably still not necessarily the most effective way of pushing information out to people. So again, I don't know what the potential size of your target audience is, and therefore how many of those people you're actually reaching through the posts that you give. But I, as a general rule, always believe that the most effective way of using Facebook is not to use it as a place to put information in front of people. It's to actually encourage people to talk to you, and it's through how you respond to the posts by others that you get the most value out of the usage of Facebook, mostly because you're using it as a way of understanding what your consumers are thinking about you, rather than just trying to drive this kind of notional thing called engagement with your brand. So, that would be my take on it potentially, I mean, maybe I'm wrong in your instance in that you have actually found a way of using Facebook very effectively to reach a large number of people. But that's not usually the case with most organizations.
That's great, thank you. We have another question from Jane. What are the core challenges or differences between B2B and B2C in terms of social media objectives and measurement? So quite a tricky one to answer, but I suppose, are there any kind of very obvious differences that you've come across between B2B and B2C?
Not necessarily. The interesting thing, generally, I think B2B companies find it easier to extract value from the social media space. That's because what people want to talk about there is kind of much more interesting and relevant to them. I mean, as we're starting to understand, most people aren't really that interested in consumer products. There's not a huge amount of conversation necessarily you can generate. With consumer products, people want to use the space mostly just to kind of ask questions or complain about stuff, whereas in the business-to-business space, people are much more prepared to engage in kind of more interesting and relevant conversations, or you can identify those conversations. So a bit like the IBM guys, they could find that there are some interesting conversations for them to listen to and then join in order to create sales. It's often quite a lot harder to do that in the B2B space.
Sure.
But the basic principles of how you operate and the requirement of sitting and defining, it tends to mean therefore that your objectives in B2C are often much more about how can we make our marketing more effective rather than use social media as a channel to take your marketing to people. Whereas within B2B, it's more possible to actually use social media as a channel you can take to reach people.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, we have another question. Question from Stephen. What are the biggest challenges social media marketers are facing from 2013 onwards? So obviously we only have a little bit of that left. And has this changed since last year? In other words, have you seen any challenges really evolving over this or last year? And is there anything new that we should be looking out for next year maybe?
Well, I mean, the only change that I've really noticed is that there are more organizations who are starting to work out how to use social media effectively, i.e. they're moving away from seeing it as a form of media to seeing it as a form of infrastructure, and they're moving away from trying to talk to audiences and more towards understanding how to work with individuals. So that's a kind of a process that's gradually working its way through. And you tend to see it happening much more across in the States, where there's much more kind of conversation about things like customer service, for example, and recognizing that that's where you get the value in this space from rather than kind of the creation of content. So that conversation is more advanced over there, and what tends to happen over there one year kind of happens over here the next year. The other big thing that's kind of really been emerged last year and going into next is this whole thing called big data, which is obviously connected to social to a certain extent. And it's connected to social listening, because there are two ways you can listen. You can listen to people, or you can listen to data. Social is where you listen to people, albeit you can use social activity. You can connect that to algorithms and find ways of listening to it in a data kind of sense. And that's going to become a very big issue going forwards. And in fact, the really new big thing for next year is this whole thing called the Internet of Things. So the fact that objects are now being connected to the internet, not just people, and the kind of the vast amount of data that is actually creating is going to be, I think, the kind of the new topic for next year. We're increasingly going to hear about stuff like cars or even rubbish bins. Has already happened in London. What happens when these things are created or connected to the internet and start to supply data about what it is that's going on, how they're being used? So that I think is the kind of the next hot topic for next year.
Very interesting. We've got one more question, or time for one more question rather. What are the key deciding factors whether or not to use an external agency rather than running campaigns in-house? Would you say it's resource? Which is a really interesting question. In fact, we get asked this a hell of a lot in search webinars and courses. What's your view from a social media perspective, especially coming from an agency background?
I don't think you can. If you're using an agency to do your social media, you're doing it wrong. Because you can't I mean, this is actually something that Starbucks in the States said very early on. They said you can't outsource your voice, and I think that's absolutely right. You can outsource your ears, though, so which is why I would think that the real agency opportunity and the areas you should, as a brand, should be thinking about using agencies are in agencies that can listen to the social media space and derive analysis and intelligence from it. So, that's not to say an awful lot of agencies, of course, are making an awful lot of money basically running, Facebook outposts. But that's because, and i.e. solving a resource problem, but that's only because people haven't worked out how to use social media effectively. And I've actually been following Eurostar a little bit over the years, and it's been interesting to see how they've kind of evolved through the kind of social media journey. And they've got to the point now where I've noticed they've started to become actually much more effective in how they were responding to people on their Facebook page and on Twitter. And in fact, when I contacted them, I found, I said, well, your agency's starting to seem to be performing much better now. And he said, well, actually, we've got rid of the agency. They realized that they had to actually put those people in-house. They couldn't really, there wasn't really a usage they could have for a social media agency, mostly because they didn't have the information that people required. They could pump out content, but content is not what the name of the game is. Information is what the name of the game is. Information and response.
Well, we hear very similar parallels with search as well. So yes, it makes a lot of sense. Interesting to hear your viewpoint, given your agency background as well.
Yes. Well, I'm not an agency anymore. You see, so you could say, well, it's in my interest to say that.
Well, listen, guys, thank you very much for attending today. Richard, also thank you very much. As I said to you at the beginning of today's webinar, if you missed it, this will be live on our blog in either today or Monday, and so watch that space. That's www.emarketeers.com. Thank you very much, guys, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.